When it comes to franchises that have stood the test of time, Castlevania stands proud of the best of them. Although the series would eventually evolve into a saga of Metroid-style games with heavy RPG elements, many gamers remember Castlevania for the tense and linear platforming of the originals. The Castlevania trilogy on the Nintendo Entertainment System prided itself on offering a heavy challenge to all who dared to face its horrors. The games were a massive success, and after each installment had already put their own spin on the basic jumping and whipping gameplay, what was a fourth game to do but to expand on that jumping and whipping? Super Castlevania IV arrived only months after the launch of the Super Nintendo, and perhaps more than any other game, showed off the potential that a new system could bring to an old series. Not including the old Ataris and such, the NES was the first console that really took off and launched the entire concept of gaming at home. So when it came time for the SNES, developers were confused as to how they were going to continue over their existing series onto this new console. No one had really had to deal with a next generation before. Of course, after the launch, Super Mario World was hailed as an instant classic, expanding on everything that had made the previous games great with shiny new graphics to boot. Given Nintendo's obvious advantage in having developed the game along with the hardware, developers were curious. Was the game a success because of its new mechanics, or because of the extra graphical capabilities of this new console? In response, some companies merely slapped the word Super in front of their older titles, gave them a new coat of paint, and shoved them out the door. Others decided to continue developing for the NES, waiting until they had the right ideas to blow minds down the road. These were both seen as relatively safe options during the era. Konami, however, had something else in mind. Now, the Castlevania series was always about more than just blasting through the game. Even with such primitive graphics and sound, the original game had a thick sense of atmosphere, enforced by the deliberate gameplay limitations. Your jumps were rigid, your whip was slow, and you had to constantly be aware of your surroundings. There was practically zero room for error. It wasn't a horror game by any means, but that feeling of dread was still there. Because of the NES's limitations, all of these emotions had to be invoked through gameplay alone. When bringing the series to the Super Nintendo, Konami realized they had a bit more leeway in terms of how to inflict that same experience upon the player. With the much more powerful architecture of the Super Nintendo, the designers could finally give Dracula's castle and its inhabitants the visual design they deserved. Sprites could be larger, more detailed, and utilize technology that wasn't previously available. Compared to the previous entries, Super Castlevania IV was much larger in scope, and since the gameplay was no longer the sole provider of the narrative and horror elements, that allowed Konami to broaden the appeal of their gameplay. As I said, in Castlevania I, Simon was a character with many limitations in how he could move. Many of the enemies, meanwhile, were much faster and had much more erratic movements than Simon was capable of, and generally operated as complex as the NES could handle. With the SNES's improvements, however, enemies could do all kinds of crazy things, like break apart, jump around, and be much larger than before. Since the enemies had been made more mobile, Simon could also be brought up to speed as well. Thus, Super Castlevania IV saw the introduction of being able to change your momentum in midair and whipping in any direction. This was changing the two core mechanics of the series, but without sacrificing the game feel that these mechanics had enforced. The game industry was changing and becoming more popular by the second, and Super Castlevania IV may be one of the first examples of a series changing to become more accessible. Compared to its older siblings, the game isn't near as difficult, instead offering a much more forgiving experience. The key thing to take from the design of this game is that visuals aren't the only thing that can be upgraded with a new console generation. If the gameplay systems don't progress as well, then what's the point? Some would say it's best to keep gameplay and graphics separate as two distinct art forms, but gaming is so much more than that. Gaming is all these visual and audio masterpieces combined with a design that complements the both of them so that they all form a cohesive experience and one we can remember. Super Castlevania IV chose to let the graphics carry some of the weight when it came to the horrors of Dracula's castle, instead of just the control scheme. And to have made a game to become more accessible without giving up its charm, well, something like that is really freaking clever.